stop slipping and stop cutting your socks. We have 15 different color options between 3 grip socks and 2 sleeve types. Something for everybody at a price that just makes sense. Available now at puregripsocks.com. So you want to buy a pair of Diadoras in 2025. Should you spend $160 or $300? With the less expensive option being the Diadora Brasil Icon LT Plus LP12, a name that just rolls off the tongue. Where for $160, you're going to get that classic Diadora styling with the black and neon yellow colorway, what's described as a premium leather upper that I believe is some form of a calfskin, generally a more traditional design with a central lacing system and standalone tongue, along with the LP12 sole plate and stud pattern that we've seen from Diadora in the past that actually I really do like. With the more expensive option, and this is not a joke, being the Diadora Brasil Icon ITA OG LT Plus MDPU. And yes, I was reading that off a piece of paper because there was no way that I was going to remember that. With this $300 option being more true to the original Diadora Brasil, of course you still get that black and neon yellow iconic styling. The sole plate in particular just really gets me. These are made in Italy, unlike the cheaper alternative, which is made in China, and it still features what is classified as a premium leather upper, not kangaroo leather. If that were the case, I assume they would specify that. So we can assume that this is instead a calfskin material. And in comparison, again, to that cheaper alternative, it's a very different style of leather and generally a pretty different experience. Where realistically, I think there's 2 main questions that need to be answered. Is there any possible way that the OG version is worth nearly double the standard model? And for $300 in general, how do these stack up to basically every other top-end football boot on the market? Because at $300 you could buy just about anything. We're going to discuss the differences between them and also talk about how these Diadoras stack up against the much more popular alternatives in 2025. So if you're interested in learning more, including how these fit and feel on feet, please stick around. And if you are interested in either pair for yourself, you can pick them up below the normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the links down below. And really quickly, before we keep going, if you guys enjoy seeing reviews of the less popular brands on the channel, don't forget to drop a like on this one. And if you appreciate the unsponsored, unsugar-coated, brutally honest opinions on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2025. Where I guess we'll start with the upper of the standard Brasil Icon, where as you can see, you're getting what is a very puffy natural leather upper that's admittedly quite soft, but definitely on the thicker side compared to just about any other leather football boot that I've tried in recent years, which could be a good thing, but could also be a bad thing depending on what you're looking for. Where I would say that if in general you are of the opinion that football boots do not have enough padding either for touch or protection reasons, this I would say is probably the most padded football boot that you can buy right now, or at least one of the most padded. Where from a touch perspective, you can definitely still feel the ball, don't get me wrong, there's just more material and more cushion between your foot and the ball. Of course, the material is still very soft, and as you wear them in, the leather softens up even further, and a little bit of that cushion will start to break down. But overall, if you want some substance on your feet, and also really like the feel of a leather football boot, this is a fantastic option. I also really appreciate the fact that even though this is a more traditional U-throat construction with a standalone tongue, they've gone the extra mile and made the tongue from actual leather. This is one of those areas where so many brands tend to cheap out. Diadora have not done that here. And again, for $160 to get a full leather upper, I'm actually pretty impressed with these in terms of the overall quality. When it comes to the upper of the OGs, despite having a similar look because of the black and neon yellow colorway, it's more or less a completely different construction, where of course it must be said that this version is made in Italy, something that is typically associated with being ultra premium in the world of football boots, especially when you consider that Diadora is an Italian brand. Made in Italy should be the pinnacle, hence the $300 price tag. And I will say the build quality is noticeably better on this OG variant, but you should expect that for nearly double the price. Would I put it on the same level as a made in Japan Mizuno as an example? Probably not, but as far as build quality is concerned on a leather pair of football boots, I really don't have any complaints. They do seem very well made. Having said that, what I do know a lot of people will complain about is the fact that this is not a kangaroo leather upper, but instead what they simply call premium leather in the tech specs, which leads me to believe that it is some form of a calfskin, something that doesn't really bother me for an Italian football boot, given that calfskin would be native to the country of Italy. I do know that back in the day, Diadora would use kangaroo leather, and definitely it sucks at least a little bit that these aren't made from a similar type of material. But as far as leather softness is concerned, it's still really, really good. Not the best that you can get on the market, and certainly not the best for what these cost when you consider that a made in Japan Morelia 2 retails for $280. That, I think, is a step up from these in terms of overall leather quality. But certainly, if you like the Italian charm and the old school styling of a Diadora Brasil in black and neon yellow, you won't have any issues with the quality of the leather. However, in comparison to that less expensive option, the leather is definitely thinner on this OG pair, and you can see it even has more of a matte finish rather than kind of the semi-gloss of that $160 alternative. Also, it does feature a central lacing system with a standalone tongue. However, they've added in the fold over flap held down by some Velcro on the underside, and you can see on the tongue it does in fact say made in Italy. With the differences in both the leather as well as the overall construction being clear to see when the two boots are side by side. The OG pair is sleeker, more streamlined, and generally just thinner across the entire foot, where the less expensive option, like I said, is pretty much padded all over. So that's going to be your main difference that I would say is not necessarily a case of one being better than the other, but more so a matter of personal preference, where I would argue that when it comes to having the cleaner touch on the ball, the OG pair would win out. But again, they're double the price, so you kind of expect that. What I don't love though, and this seems to be a common trend when it comes to so many football boots that are made in Italy, Pantofolo d'Oro is the one that comes to mind, is if we look at this OG pair, while it does have this really soft kind of suede-like liner in the heel area, as well as an internal structure, there's basically no padding. A little bit of cushion up top, but as you get to the bottom, press against that heel, and it is directly against the internal structure that is more or less rock hard. And in my opinion, they did do a good job with the shaping. However, depending on the specific shape of your heel, there could definitely be some significant pressure kind of pushing on the back of that internal heel counter, which for the most part is typically not very comfortable. Where in the case of the less expensive option, you can see it's not that synthetic suede, but instead a synthetic leather with tons of padding all the way through, although arguably too much, with that padding kind of extending along the sides, whereas you can see from this opening, it's quite large and very bulky along the edges, which you'll see during the on-feet portion of the video is an aesthetic that I'm not in love with. I wouldn't say that it's particularly noticeable when it comes to actually playing in the boots, but overall, I do think that this less expensive version, particularly in the heel area, is more comfortable, although there's definite room for improvement from both of these. The insoles on both are fully removable, and as you can see, more or less exactly the same, the only difference being that one is more Italian than the other. And this is kind of a funny thing, and I'm only showing it to you because it is mentioned in the tech specs. On the cheaper pair, you just have nothing underneath the insole, where on the OG pair, they put this tiny little circular piece of foam for additional heel cushioning and list that as a tech spec feature. And then when it comes to the sole plate and stud pattern, do you want something more modern and aggressive, or do you want something more traditional and, dare I say, bulkier? What I do like about both of these boots is they have the 3 rivets connecting the sole plate to the upper at the tip of the toe, and on the OG made in Italy pair, they even put a rivet here at the back of the heel. Again, just an old school build quality thing that I think Diadora have done a really good job with both of these boots. As it relates to this particular sole plate, it's kind of like a variation of a classic Adidas Copa Mundial. Definitely a little bit thinner and more low profile in that it doesn't feel quite as bulky, but from a flex perspective, it's just very flexible all the way through. And the stud pattern is pretty well all conical studs, offering really good traction, don't get me wrong, but if you're looking for something that is aggressive like most modern boots have on offer, that's not necessarily what these are designed to deliver. This is very true to the original, and don't get me wrong, will definitely get you by, but it is without question on the traditional side. With the LP12 sole plate and stud pattern on the less expensive model, definitely being a lot more modern in terms of the type of plastic used, and with more flexibility in the forefoot, but also more rigidity through the heel and midfoot. As the name would suggest, you have 12 studs in total that have this kind of teardrop shape to them. So it is somewhat of a hybrid between a conical as well as a bladed stud, but for the most part, they definitely have more of a conical feel. And as you can see, they're a little bit longer and certainly more narrow in profile than what you're going to find from that Made in Italy OG variation, simply just offering more bite when pushing off. Really good sole plate and stud pattern. Definitely, I would say, one of the more underrated ones, especially in that $150 or so price range. And again, despite the lower cost, this very much, to me, feels like a high-end sole plate and stud pattern. I think it's the better one of the two, but at the same time, they're not really trying to be the same thing. And then there's the weight, where obviously we want to see which one is lighter between these two, but also I think comparison is important, especially given that the OG pair retails for $300. So how light is it compared to the $280 made in Japan Mizuno Morelia 2, all in the same size, 9.5 US. We'll start off with the least expensive $160 Brasil. They weigh in at 10.85 ounces, the equivalent of 308 grams. So obviously not very lightweight by modern football boot standards. Then we'll throw on the Made in Italy OG pair, and they weigh in at 10.55 ounces, the equivalent of 299 grams. So just a little bit lighter than the non-Made in Italy Brasil. And then if we throw on the Mizuno Morelias, they weigh in at 7.5 ounces, the equivalent of 213 grams. In other words, from both a feel and weight perspective, these Diadoras are going to feel as old school as they look, and in comparison to, again, a less expensive alternative from Mizuno, they are up nearly 100 grams, which for a pair of football boots in the same size is a lot. When it comes to the fit and feel on feet, despite looking quite different from each other and despite having completely different sole plates, they actually don't feel that different. What I will say is that the leather on both boots obviously feels very soft and is only going to get softer as you wear them in, because it's a full leather upper. The boots are able to stretch to the exact shape of your feet, where certainly if you need a little bit of extra width, or you always find that football boots just don't fit you quite the way that you'd like, going for something with a full leather upper is going to allow for that customization as you wear them in. The Diadora logo in synthetic through the midfoot is going to help in preventing the upper from overstretching on you, and in general, they feel like you would more or less expect a soft leather upper football boot to feel like. What I will say is I am not in love with the heel on either of these boots. On the OG pair, like I mentioned, it's very thin with no padding, but has that really grippy kind of heel liner with that suede-like material that just puts a lot of pressure on your heel, where for me personally, it matches the shape of my heel quite well, but I could definitely see somebody with a little bit of a bump on their heel or somebody that's a little bit wider, just depending on the specific shape, it could be very uncomfortable for you. So definitely something to be aware of. And with the less expensive variation, there's just so much padding that once again, it just puts a lot of pressure on the back of your heel. And as you can see at the sides of the ankle, it flares out so much just because of how much padding there is, where when you look down at your feet, there's just tons of extra material kind of pulling away from the upper that admittedly you don't really feel when you're playing in the boots, but aesthetically, I absolutely do not like the way that they look when you look down at your feet, which I think is pretty important for a pair of football boots, something that is often very overlooked. The sole plates, despite being different, like I said, don't really feel that different from each other. Both are solid, and I would say err on the more flexible side. Definitely the OG sole plate feels that little bit thicker, but that's really the only difference that you can feel. And from a width and sizing perspective, both are obviously very wide, tons of width through the heel and midfoot area, and then they taper quite a bit as you get into the forefoot toe box. But again, they're leather, they're going to stretch as you wear them in, so these should work for most people. Although I will say the OGs are that little bit wider and a little bit deeper in terms of the overall shape. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing both of these boots in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length seems to be perfect. So regardless of which variation that you're going for, or if you're just going for a Diadora Brasil in general, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. Where in conclusion, I really don't want to come across as a Diadora hater because I genuinely love the brand, and honestly, I really like both of these football boots from an experience perspective. And that is the unfortunate part of both of these products, in that even at $160, while there is some definite value here, they're not really the boots that I would choose to wear. And certainly at $300, while I think it's overall a solid product and probably very true to an OG pair, by modern day standards, if you want an ultra premium full leather football boot, once again, they're just not what I would choose. Where I guess if you just really wanted the nostalgia of a Diadora Brasil in black and neon yellow, I don't necessarily think that you're going to be unhappy with either of these football boots. But if we're really just choosing what is the best option for how much they cost, neither of these are the best option. And I guess to answer the question that I said I would answer at the beginning of the video, if I was given the choice between the two, I would probably pick the OGs, although I would be just as happy to play in the less expensive option. But like I said, both have their problems where they wouldn't be a first choice.